The Dakota Territory, February 1881. The wind screamed across the prairie at 60 miles per hour, driving snow like frozen needles through every crack and gap. Inside a single-room log cabin, a family of 4 huddled around their last armload of firewood. The temperature outside had dropped to 40 below zero. Their neighbors 3 miles south would be found frozen solid in their beds come spring. But this family survived. They used a technique so counterintuitive that modern survivalists would call it insane. They deliberately buried their home in the very element trying to kill them: snow. What they did next defied all logic, but it saved their lives. Every frontier cabin had a fatal design flaw that killed more settlers than disease, accidents, or starvation combined. It was not the logs themselves, it was what happened underneath them. The foundation gap. That seemingly innocent space between the bottom log and the frozen ground became a pipeline for death. Cold air would pour through this gap like water through a broken dam, stealing precious heat from the cabin floor. Even with careful chinking between the logs, the sill logs, those bottom timbers resting closest to the earth were the weak point in every cabin's defense. The brutal mathematics of heat loss were simple. A single gap, the width of a pencil running the length of a 20-foot cabin wall, would let in enough cold air to drop the interior temperature by 15 degrees. The human body, working desperately to maintain its core temperature of 98.6 degrees, would burn through calories at a terrifying rate just trying to stay alive. Conduction was the first killer. The frozen ground beneath the cabin acted like a massive heat sink, a frozen thief that would never be satisfied. A man sitting on a cold cabin floor was in direct contact with the earth through those floorboards. His body heat would flow downward, pulled into the frozen ground like water into sand. Convection was the second killer. Every gust of wind that found its way under the cabin would create air currents that carried warm air up and out through the gaps in the walls. The cabin became a chimney in reverse, constantly pulling heat away from the people inside. The settlers who built these cabins understood wood. They knew how to notch logs and chink gaps. They could build a structure that would stand for decades. But they did not understand the physics of heat transfer. They fought the cold with brute force, burning through cord after cord of precious firewood, trying to heat not just their cabin, but the entire frozen prairie beneath it. Real accounts tell the story. Families found frozen in their beds, their fires still smoldering in the hearth. Children who never woke up from their sleep, their small bodies unable to generate enough heat to survive the night. Women who froze to death while cooking breakfast, the cabin so cold that their breath formed ice crystals in the air. The foundation gap was not just an inconvenience, it was a death sentence. A family could have a roaring fire, a cabin full of smoke and flame, and still freeze to death because all that heat was being sucked down into the earth and blown away by the wind. This was the problem that killed thousands of pioneers. The cold was not just outside their homes, it was inside, rising up through the floorboards, flowing in through every gap and crack, turning their shelter into a trap. But some settlers figured out the solution. They learned to turn winter itself into their ally. The solution came from the most unlikely source: snow banking. While their neighbors fought the winter, the survivors learned to make the winter fight for them. They took shovels, sometimes just their bare hands, and did something that seemed like madness. They buried their cabins. Starting in late November, before the worst storms hit, they would pile snow against the exterior walls of their cabin. Not just a little snow, massive berms sometimes reaching all the way to the windowsills. They would pack the snow tight, layer by layer, until their cabin looked like it was growing out of the earth itself. The science was simple, even if they did not know the words for it. Snow is 90% trapped air. Each snowflake, when it settles and compacts, creates thousands of tiny air pockets. Air does not conduct heat, it holds it. A 3-foot wall of packed snow was better insulation than anything they could buy in the cities back east. But the real genius was not just the insulation. It was what the snow wall did to the wind. Wind was the invisible killer. A wind of 20 miles per hour could make a temperature of 0 degrees feel like 30 below. That wind would find every gap, every crack, every weakness in the cabin's defenses. It would pour under the sill logs like a frozen river, stealing heat faster than any fire could replace it. The snow berm eliminated the wind completely. It created a dead airspace around the foundation of the cabin. The wind would hit that wall of snow and deflect upward over the cabin, leaving the vulnerable foundation area completely calm. No wind meant no convection. No convection meant the heat stayed where it belonged. The tools were simple: a shovel if they had one, a wooden scoop carved from a single piece of pine, sometimes just a bucket or a basket. They would work methodically, hauling snow from the surrounding area, building their protective wall one load at a time. Timing was everything. Too early, a warm spell would melt their work. Too late, and they would be building in the middle of a blizzard. The smart settlers watched the signs. When the leaves were all down and the first hard freeze locked the ground solid, that is when they started building their snow fortress. They learned regional tricks through hard experience. In the Great Plains, where the wind never stopped, they built their berms higher on the windward side. In the Great Lakes region, where heavy snows were guaranteed, they learned to shape the berms to shed the drifting snow away from the cabin walls. In the Rocky Mountain territories, where temperatures could swing 40 degrees in a single day, they learned to pack the snow with water, creating an ice shell that would not melt during the brief warm spells. The technique worked when expensive alternatives failed. Rich settlers who tried to insulate with store-bought materials, layers of newspaper, or even imported wool blankets still froze. Their fancy solutions could not compete with the simple physics of a snow wall. But this was not just about survival, it was about psychology. Instead of cowering inside their cabins, fighting a losing battle against the cold, these settlers stepped outside and took control. They turned the blizzard into building material. They made winter work for them instead of against them. Every shovelful of snow was a small victory against the elements. Every foot of berm was proof that humans could adapt, could think, could survive. The snow wall was not just insulation. It was hope made solid, packed tight against the foundation of their home. When the worst storms came, when the wind howled and the temperature dropped to depths that killed, these families slept warm. Their fires burned steady and low. Their fuel lasted through the longest nights, and their children woke up alive. They had learned the secret. Sometimes the best way to fight your enemy is to make your enemy fight for you. The snow wall did not just keep the cold out. It transformed the entire heating system of the cabin, creating efficiencies that modern engineers would recognize, but pioneers discovered through desperate trial and error. Before the snow berm, a typical frontier family burned through 8 to 10 cords of wood every winter. That is a stack of split logs 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 80 feet long. Cutting, splitting, and hauling that much wood was a full-time job. It started in summer and never really ended. Families would work from dawn to dusk, racing against the calendar, knowing that running out of fuel meant death. After banking their cabin with snow, that same family might burn only 4 or 5 cords. The difference was not just comfort, it was survival. Those saved cords meant the difference between making it through a harsh winter and freezing in February when the wood ran out. The snow wall created what we now call a thermal envelope. The cabin was no longer fighting to heat the entire frozen prairie. Instead, it was heating a smaller, controlled space. The dead air trapped between the snow berm and the cabin wall acted like a buffer zone, a layer of insulation that got warmer as the winter progressed. Here is where it gets interesting. As the family heated their cabin from the inside, some of that heat would migrate through the log walls into the dead airspace behind the snow. That trapped air would warm up, sometimes reaching temperatures 20 or 30 degrees higher than the outside air. The cabin was essentially wearing a warm jacket of dead air, held in place by the snow. The thermal mass effect made the system even more efficient. All that packed snow did not just insulate, it stored heat. During the day, when the sun hit the snow berm, it would absorb and hold that solar energy. At night, when temperatures plummeted, the snow would slowly release that stored heat back toward the cabin. The berm became a giant battery, storing warmth during the day and giving it back when it was needed most. Pioneers noticed their floors stayed warmer. Before the snow banking, the cabin floor was always the coldest part of the room. Children would wake up to find frost on their blankets, even with a fire burning all night. After building the berm, the floor temperature would stabilize. No more frozen feet on winter mornings. No more ice forming in the water bucket by the door. The cabin heated faster and stayed warmer longer. A fire that used to take an hour to warm the room would have the place comfortable in 20 minutes. When the fire died down to coals, the cabin would hold its heat for hours instead of minutes. Families could let their fires burn low during the night, conserving precious fuel while still staying warm. This was technology that matched what we use today. Modern building codes require insulation with an R value of 15 or higher for foundation walls. A 3-foot snow berm provided an R value of approximately 12 to 15, depending on how well it was packed. These pioneers, working with shovels and desperation, were creating insulation systems that met modern standards. But they also discovered something that modern builders sometimes miss: the psychological impact of controlling your environment. Instead of being victims of the weather, these families became partners with winter. They learned to read the snow, to understand which types packed best, which conditions made the strongest berms. They developed techniques for maintaining their snow walls. After a warm spell that softened the berm, they would repack the settling snow, adding fresh layers to maintain the insulation. During blizzards, they would venture out to shape the drifting snow, directing it to reinforce weak spots in their defenses. The snow wall was not just about surviving winter, it was about mastering it. These settlers learned that the difference between life and death was not always about having more resources. Sometimes it was about using the resources you had more intelligently. They turned their greatest enemy into their most reliable ally. We have forgotten this knowledge, and it is making us vulnerable. Modern survival training focuses on high-tech gear. Expensive sleeping bags rated to -40, space-age materials that promise to keep you warm in any conditions, portable heaters that run on batteries or fuel canisters. We have become dependent on technology that can fail, run out of power, or break when we need it most. But here is the problem nobody talks about. When the power grid fails, when the supply chains break down, when the systems we depend on stop working, we are suddenly exposed. We find ourselves in the same position as those frontier families, trapped in structures that cannot hold heat, burning through fuel we cannot replace, fighting a battle we do not know how to win. The pioneers who mastered the snow wall technique understood something we have forgotten. Survival is not about having the best gear. It is about understanding your environment well enough to make it work for you. They knew that fighting nature was a losing battle. The cold was bigger than they were, more persistent, more patient. It would outlast any fire, any fuel supply, any amount of stored food. So instead of fighting it, they learned to redirect it. They turned winter's greatest weapon, the snow itself, into their shield. This was not just practical knowledge. It was a different way of thinking about problems. When modern people face a challenge, we tend to throw resources at it. More heat, more insulation, more technology. The pioneers learned to think like engineers. They looked for leverage points, ways to get maximum results from minimum effort. The snow wall was pure leverage. A few hours of work with a shovel could cut their fuel consumption in half. A technique that cost nothing but labor could mean the difference between life and death. They found a way to make winter work harder for them than they had to work against winter. We have lost that mindset. We have become consumers instead of problem solvers. When our heating system fails, we call a repair service. When our insulation is not working, we buy better insulation. We have outsourced our survival to specialists and systems we do not understand. But the knowledge is still there, waiting to be rediscovered. The physics have not changed. Snow is still 90% trapped air. Wind still steals heat through convection. Thermal mass still stores and releases energy. The principles that saved those pioneer families will work just as well today. The real lesson is not about snow walls. It is about adaptation. Those settlers did not have the luxury of waiting for someone else to solve their problems. They had to observe, experiment, and learn. They had to become students of their environment, reading the signs that meant survival or death. They developed what we might call environmental intelligence. They knew which way the wind blew strongest, which side of their cabin lost heat fastest, and how different types of snow behaved when packed. They learned to see winter not as a season to endure, but as a system to understand and work with. This knowledge was earned through suffering. Every technique they developed was tested in conditions where failure meant death. They did not have the option of giving up, calling for help, or waiting for better conditions. They had to make it work with what they had, where they were, right then. That is the knowledge we have lost. Not just the specific techniques, but the mindset that created them. The willingness to observe, adapt, and take responsibility for our own survival. Those pioneer families who learned to build snow walls did not just survive winter, they mastered it, turning their greatest enemy into their most reliable ally. They understood something we have forgotten. Sometimes the best defense is not fighting harder, but thinking smarter. If you want to see more forgotten survival wisdom that could save your life, subscribe for stories the history books missed.